December 1944. By all appearances, the war in Europe was already over. In London, newspapers splashed victory across their front pages. In Paris, GIS. Crowded cafes, clinking glasses of champagne, and flirting with French girls under tinsel and cheap Christmas lights. In Washington, staff officers were drawing up plans for victory parades and post-war assignments. The consensus from the top down was simple. Hitler was finished. His armies were out of fuel, out of planes, out of time. The Nazi war machine, they said, was collapsing under its own weight. They were wrong. While politicians and generals savored their triumph, one man sat alone in a dim room in eastern France, staring at a wall-sized map that refused to celebrate. Cigarette smoke hung in the air. Colored pins and greased pencil lines crisscrossed the continent. To everyone else, those symbols meant victory. To him, they whispered something else, a warning, where others saw a beaten enemy withdrawing to lick its wounds. He saw something far more dangerous, an enemy disappearing. He saw whole German armies fading from reconnaissance reports. Divisions that should have been fighting simply vanish. If he was right, the war would not end with parade. It would end with a slaughter. Out on the front pages and newsreels, the star of the show was General George S. Patton. Patton was everything a war-hungry public loved. Loud, theatrical, fearless. He wore polished boots and ivory-handled revolvers. He talked about destiny, about being a warrior reborn from ancient battles. To his troops, he was old blood and guts, the man who had stormed across France with his armored columns, moving faster than anyone thought possible. He loved speed, shock, and attack. Never pause, never retreat, never look back. But in the winter of 1944, for all his bravado and brilliance, Patton's greatest weapon wasn't his tanks or his speeches. It was a quiet man with thick glasses and ink-stained fingers who rarely stepped outside the map room. His name was Colonel Oscar Patton's chief of intelligence, the mind behind the muscle. Where Patton chased glory on the battlefield, hunted ghosts on paper. Each day he stood before the huge situation map at 3rd Army Headquarters, marking the locations of every known German unit. He tracked those divisions like a hunter tracking a wounded predator, noting every shift, every gap, every pattern. And then in late October, the patterns broke. One by one, the most dangerous German formations evaporated from the map. The 6th Panzer Army disappeared. The 5th Panzer Army disappeared. These weren't battered remnants. They were elite armored forces, SS Panzer divisions, Tiger and Panther units. Hardened by years on the Eastern Front. One week they were fighting in the north. The next they were nowhere. At Supreme Headquarters, the big picture analyst shrugged. Radio traffic from those sectors went quiet. Allied bombers reported fewer targets. The skies over the German border looked empty. To the optimists, this was easy to explain. The Germans must be pulling back, conserving fuel, digging in for a last-ditch defense behind the Rhine. They declared that the enemy was finally breaking, finally giving up. Silence, they decided, was proof of weakness. Saw the same silence and came to a very different conclusion. Armies don't just disappear. Tanks don't dissolve into thin air. If the most lethal armored corps in Europe had vanished from the map, it meant they weren't gone. It meant they were hiding. And if they were hiding, they were planning to strike. Began to dig. He ignored the upbeat summaries from London and the cheerful talking points making their way through the chain of command. He turned instead to the details other people skimmed past, dull railway reports, obscure agent messages, scattered reconnaissance photos. On nighttime aerial images of German rail lines, he noticed heavy freight trains, heading west toward the front, always under the cover of darkness. Why would a supposedly retreating army send equipment and fuel toward the front line instead of pulling it back from field agents and local informants? He saw another pattern. German civilians living near a quiet, heavily forested region called the Ardennes were being evacuated. Entire villages were being moved out, roads being cleared, Why empty a safe? Sector, unless those roads were needed for something huge? Then there was the weather. Meteorological reports warned of a massive storm system rolling in from the Atlantic. Heavy snow, freezing rain, dense fog. It would turn the skies into soup. For the Allied air forces, that kind of weather was a nightmare. Planes would be grounded. Observation. Flights would stop without fighter bombers overhead. American Sherman tanks, already outgunned by German Tigers, would be exposed. To most, the forecast was an inconvenience. To it was the missing piece. Bad weather meant blind skies. Blind skies meant perfect cover. The Germans weren't retreating. They were concentrating. They were using the quiet Ardennes, the nursery sector, where exhausted American divisions were sent to rest, as the stage for one last brutal gamble. Did what intelligence officers are supposed to do. He put the pieces together. Elite panzer armies vanishing from the map. Supply trains creeping forward at night. Civilians evacuated from villages near the Ardennes. Radio silence in all the wrong places. Storm clouds that would hide German movements and Allied air power. Separate, those facts were meaningless. Together they spelled catastrophe. The Ardennes was not a sleepy backwater. It was a loaded gun pointed at the heart of the Allied line. All that remained was the hardest part, convincing someone with power to listen. Help us grow. Your super chats and super stickers directly support the channel and future content. In early December 1944, the mood at Allied headquarters was intoxicated by success. The front line stretched for hundreds of miles, and the Allied armies pushed relentlessly toward the German border. Commanders talked about pursuit, about finishing the job before the new year. Staff officers argued over who would reach the Rhine first. When raised concerns, he didn't get curiosity. He got smirks. Other intelligence staff labeled him a pessimist, a worrier, a man who saw problems where everyone else saw victory. They pointed to German fuel shortages, to wrecked factories, to shattered Luftwaffe squadrons. They can't possibly launch a major offensive. They insisted they don't have the fuel. It's not just unlikely, it's mathematically impossible. Didn't shout back. He didn't pound the table or try to win the argument with theatrics. Instead, he did something more unnerving. He kept working. On the giant map he maintained for Patton, he took a greased pencil and drew a bold red question mark over the Ardennes. Next, intelligence from various sources converged. More rail shipments, more evacuations, more hints from prisoners, and intercepts that something big was coming. Cole saw the window closing. If Patton's Third Army continued its drive eastward without adjusting, it would overextend its flank. A sudden German blow from the Ardennes could slice the Allied line in two, isolating entire armies and turning a march to victory into a disaster. Made his decision. If no one else would listen, he would go straight to the one man who might. Entering George Patton's office was not a comfortable experience. Patton was famous for his temper, his harsh tongue, his absolute intolerance for what he considered cowardice or defeatism. He wanted aggressive plans, not warnings. His instinct was always forward, telling him to slow down, to pivot, to prepare for defense against an attack most people didn't believe in. That was like walking into a lion's den with bad news. Walked in carrying his map and his notes. He spread them out on Patton's desk. The room fell quiet. He didn't deliver a dramatic speech. He didn't accuse anyone. He simply pointed. Here were the missing armored divisions. Here were the rail lines running at night. Here were the towns being emptied. Here was the weather report. Here was the gap in the Allied line where green and exhausted units sat in thin positions, assuming they were safe. Calmly explained that the German capability existed. Calmly, he argued that the Ardennes was the only logical place for a major counteroffensive. Then he pointed at that big red question mark on the map. They're going to hit us here, he said. For a moment, nothing happened. Staff officers waited for the explosion. They expected Patton to lash out, to ridicule the warnings, to insist on pushing east. Instead, the general walked to the window and stared at the gray winter sky. He had worked with long enough to know this much. The quiet colonel didn't trade in guesses. If took the risk of putting his reputation on the line, it meant the danger was real. Patton turned back, studied the map again, and muttered almost to himself, "It's the perfect place. They'll try to cut the front in half." Then he did something few leaders ever manage. He set his ego aside. Patton abandoned his cherished plan of continuing the drive east. Instead of insisting that his vision was infallible, he looked at and asked one simple question. "What do we do?" Didn't hesitate. He had thought this through. Third Army, he said, needed a contingency plan, a secret one. They had to be ready at a moment's notice, to pivot north, turning the entire army 90 degrees, to smash into the flank of a German breakthrough in the Ardennes. It sounded straightforward in theory. In practice, it was like deciding to spin a fully loaded freight train on ice, to reorient an army of 250,000 men, with thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and supply trucks in the dead of winter, required a miracle of logistics. New routes had to be scouted, bridges tested for tank weight, fuel dumps repositioned, ammunition stocks moved, communications laid out along entirely new axes. Units currently facing east would have to be ready to disengage, wheel north, and fight an enemy that wasn't yet visible. It would all have to be done in secret, so as not to panic. Superiors who still believed the enemy was broken. Patton didn't flinch. "Do it," he ordered. "Start planning. Don't tell Eisenhower yet. He won't believe it, but we'll be ready." For the next week, Third Army lived a double life. On paper, in the communiques sent up the chain, it was preparing to invade Germany, sharpening the spear that would push through the SAR and beyond. Behind closed doors, in late-night sessions that blurred into dawn, Coe and Patton, staff crafted an entirely different script. They traced narrow country roads on maps, calculating which ones could carry armor columns in snow. They moved fuel under cover, positioning it where future northbound columns would need it. They identified staging areas, fallback points, and routes for field hospitals. Orders were typed and locked in safes, ready to be released with a single code phrase. Third Army had become two armies at once. The one everyone expected, and the Ghost Army only a handful of men knew existed. 60 miles to the north, the unwitting victims of the coming storm sat in their foxholes, shivering and bored. The Ardennes sector was considered a quiet front, a place for units to rest or inexperienced troops to learn the ropes. The 106th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Golden Lions, held parts of the line, many of its men barely out of training. Nearby, battle-worn formations like the 28th Infantry were licking their wounds from brutal fighting in the Hürtgen forest. These soldiers worried more about frostbite than enemy attacks. They complained about thin winter gear, wrote letters home about Christmas presents, and traded rumors about going home soon. The forest was dark and still. They couldn't see the white-clad German infantry slipping into position in the trees. They couldn't hear the low growl of engines from hundreds of tanks and assault guns waiting just beyond the ridges, their muzzles already dialed in on American positions. On the night of December 15th, sat alone with his map. By now, the flood of data he had, tracked for weeks, had slowed to a trickle. There was almost nothing left to interpret. The enemy had taken his positions. The trap was set. Kutch had done everything a single intelligence officer could do. He had seen the pattern, raised the alarm, equipped his commander with a plan. He removed his glasses, rubbed his tired eyes, and understood what came next was beyond his control. On the map, the red question mark over the Ardennes seemed to glow in. The lamplight, a silent accusation against everyone who had dismissed the threat. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, 1944, the forest answered the question. It began not with a single gunshot, but with an explosion that seemed to rip the world open. 1,600 German artillery pieces fired at the same instant there. shells screaming over the treetops. The night sky over the Ardennes turned into a wall of orange-white fire. The earth shuddered with such force that some men were literally thrown out of their foxholes. Trees that had stood for decades snapped like twigs. Shrapnel shredded blankets, bodies and frozen, soil alike. Telephone lines vanished in the first moments. Command posts dug deep into ground were crushed or buried. For the teenagers huddled in shallow trenches, the difference between sleep and death was less than a heartbeat. Then the shells stopped and a new nightmare rolled forward on steel. Tracks. Out of the fog lurched tiger tanks and king tigers, monstrous silhouettes in the swirling smoke. Their armor thick enough to shrug off the standard American bazooka. They rolled through shattered woods, flattening jeeps, bunkers, and men beneath their treads. Behind them, advanced infantry in ruins. It was the largest mass surrender of U.S. troops in the European theater. Back at higher headquarters, the first radio reports sounded like hallucinations. Operators screamed into their sets about German tanks in the Ardennes, about entire regiments being overrun. Officers in rear command posts answered with disbelief and anger. Impossible, they barked. There are no German armored units there. The map in front of them said so. The Allies had declared the sector safe. Reality did not care. In just 6 hours, German forces had punched a 5M wide hole in the Allied front. They poured through it like floodwater, surging toward the Meuse River and, beyond it, the crucial port of Antwerp. If they reached it, they could split the British and American armies, choke off supplies, and force the Allies into a desperate, drawn-out struggle instead of a swift victory. The stakes had shifted. In an instant back to survival. In Paris, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, stared grimly at the map as fresh reports arrived. Red arrows marking German advances stretched deeper by the hour. His intelligence staff, blindsided, mumbled excuses about bad weather, radio silence, the difficulty of penetrating German deception. But in Third Army headquarters, there was no confusion. No one had to guess what was happening or where it was headed. Walked into Patton's office holding new reports. He didn't look smug or triumphant. He simply stated the obvious. The attack was unfolding exactly where they had predicted on the timetable he had warned about. Patton didn't waste words. He glanced at the map, now showing the ghost divisions revealing themselves in force. Then at Coke, the time for preparation was over. The time for execution had arrived. Eisenhower summoned his senior commanders to an emergency conference in Verdun on December 19th. The room they met in was cold. The heating had failed, and generals clustered around a potbelly stove, rubbing their hands as they studied the growing bulge in the line. The mood was somewhere between shock and dread. They all knew what a well-executed German offensive could mean. They had not expected to face one ever again. Eisenhower laid it out bluntly. The Germans had created a huge bulge in the front, driving west through the Ardennes. Someone had to hit that bulge from the south hard and fast to keep it from turning into a complete rupture. His eyes turned to Patton. How long, he asked, would it take for Third Army, which was fighting to the southeast, to disengage, turn, and attack north against the German flank? Other officers in the room did the math in their heads. Third Army's front stretched over 100 miles. It commanded roughly 130,000. Vehicles, tanks, trucks, artillery, bulldozers, ambulances to pull them out, turn them around on icy roads, drive them into a blizzard, and launch a coordinated assault. A week, 10 days. Anything less was fantasy. Patton didn't check notes. He didn't confer with staff. He didn't even hesitate. He told Eisenhower he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room fell silent. A British officer laughed under his breath, calling it impossible, warning Patton not to act like a fool. Moving a corps that fast was, by the accepted laws of war, insane. But Patton wasn't guessing. He had his trump card. A week earlier, acting on Cox's warnings, he had ordered his staff to draw up exactly such a maneuver. The plan had a name, Gabriel, and it was already written. All it needed was Eisenhower's blessing and a single phone. Call. Eisenhower studied Patton's face, the unblinking certainty there. He weighed the risk of betting on something no staff college would recommend. Then he gave his answer. Okay, George, start. The ball rolling. Patton walked out, found a phone, called his headquarters, and spoke the code words. Play ball, Gabriel. With that, the impossible began. Third Army didn't merely turn. It pivoted like a great serpent coiling back on itself. Columns of tanks and trucks pulled away from their positions. Wheels grinding over frozen mud. Vehicles slid into ditches and were shoved aside to keep the flow moving. Mechanics worked by lantern light to keep engines running in sub-zero temperatures. Soldiers, their uniforms stiff with ice, packed into open trucks, shivering as the wind knifed through them. Patton drove along the routes in his open Jeep, standing upright, screaming at stalled drivers in traffic jams, reminding them that men were dying to north every minute they hesitated. It was chaos harnessed by willpower and planning a logistical nightmare turned into motion. But while Patton raced north, another drama played out in a small Belgian crossroads town that had suddenly become the center of the universe, Baston. There, where 7 roads met, elements of the famed 101st Airborne Division and other units dug in against the German advance. They were surrounded, cut off, low on ammunition, lacking proper winter gear, treating wounded in dark cellars with almost no medical supplies. German artillery pounded the town relentlessly. Luftwaffe bombers roared overhead whenever the weather allowed. 4 German divisions encircled them. When the German commander sent a formal demand for surrender, warning of total destruction, acting U.S. Commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe read it, laughed, and dictated a one-word reply. Nuts. The Germans, baffled by the slang, were informed that it essentially meant they could go to hell. The Germans answered that insult with everything. They had bombs, shells, infantry assaults, but the paratroopers refused to give way. They fought with frozen fingers, scavenged weapons, and sheer stubbornness, clinging to the ruined edges of the town while waiting for a rescue they could only hope was coming. Patton, driving his army north through ice and fire, knew that if he failed, Baston would fall, and with it, the entire southern shoulder of the Allied line. There was one more obstacle he couldn't shout down: the sky. The same bad weather the Germans had counted on still hung over the front. Fog and clouds grounded Allied aircraft, leaving German armor free to move and resupply under cover. Patton understood that even his racing columns needed air support too, smashed through the last offenses. So he did something that sounded almost absurd. He called in his chaplain, Father O'Neill, and demanded a prayer for better weather. Fuel shortages bit hard. Destroyed vehicles littered the roads. And then on December 26th came the moment the men in Baston had dreamed of. Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding a Sherman tank, called Cobra King, crested a hill south of the town after 3 days of constant combat. Exhausted, running on adrenaline and fumes, he scanned the horizon through his periscope and saw a line of foxholes in the snow, helmets barely visible, not knowing whether they were friend or foe. He inched the tank forward, the crew ready to fire at the slightest hostile move. As the distance closed, a figure rose from one of the foxholes, a paratrooper wearing the familiar American helmet, gaunt and shaking, frost clinging to his face. Bob Gass opened the hatch, climbed out into the frigid air, and walked forward with his hand extended. The paratrooper took it, tears freezing on his cheeks, and Bog told him he figured they were glad to see Third Army. With that handshake, the siege of Bastogne was effectively broken. Ambulances and supply trucks soon followed, rolling into the battered town like lifelines. News of the link-up spread quickly. When it reached Patton, aside and says you're drinking too much and you laugh it off because the parties are fun. Those people are not trying to ruin your celebration. They're trying to keep you from driving into the dark forest without a map The tragedy of the Battle of the Bulge wasn't that the Germans attacked. Enemies attack, that's their job. The real tragedy was that so many warnings were available and so few were heeded. 19,000 Americans died. 47,000 were wounded. 23,000 were missing or captured. Nearly 100,000 Germans were killed, wounded, or lost. The snow that melted in early 1945 revealed a landscape of burnt tanks and frozen bodies, a brutal invoice for arrogance, all because for too long the people in charge preferred the comfort of good news over the discomfort of the truth. Don't let that be your story. When the quiet voice in your life speaks, when someone you trust points to the metaphorical aren't and says there's danger there, pause. Turn down the volume on the people telling you everything is fine. Put your ego aside, long enough to really look at the map, because the loud voices will happily assure you that the war is almost over, that you've already won, that you'll be home by Christmas. The quiet voices will tell you where the tigers are hiding, and if you listen to them, they might just save your life. This channel exists to find those quiet voices, past and present. We dig for the forgotten reports, the buried memos, the names left out of the headlines. We believe that the missing pages of history often matter more than the ones everyone knows by heart. If you believe that, too, if you think the truth is worth hearing, even when it whispers, then join us. Subscribe, turn on notifications, share these stories with someone who needs to hear them. There are still thousands of files waiting to be opened, thousands of overlooked men and women who changed the course of events from the shadows. I'll see you in the next briefing. And before you go, help us grow. Your super chats and super stickers directly support the channel and future content.